My sister gave up her surgical career to care for our brother for 15 years without a vacation, then asked us for $200 each to hire a nurse for a week. When we all said no, she smiled and said, "Watch me," and took a job at Mass General. I didn't say a word. That was 18 months ago. Last week, I saw her standing beside him as he took his first steps. My sister Rose was supposed to be a surgeon, until our brother Jack got hit by a truck and could never walk again, that is, because she was the only one who actually stepped up to take care of him. Mom was too old, Dad had his heart condition, our brother Jake lived across the country with his perfect family, and me? I was useless back then, helplessly addicted to drugs and barely keeping my own life together. So Rose took initiative to house him, but it was never supposed to be permanent. Then 15 years passed, 15 years of lifting Jack in and out of bed, managing his medications, driving to endless doctor appointments, and we all just let it happen. Until last month, when everything finally came crashing down. Rose got an invitation to her best friend Ashley's wedding in Hawaii. They'd been inseparable since middle school. Ashley even delayed her wedding date 3 times, hoping Rose could make it. This was the last reschedule. Rose hadn't asked us for anything in years, not one thing, but she called a family meeting, made coffee for everyone, even baked Dad's favorite banana bread. She looked so hopeful, sitting there at Mom's kitchen table. "I just need help covering a professional respite care nurse for 1 week," she said, showing us the quote she'd gotten. "I've saved up half already. If everyone chips in $200, I can swing it." She had this whole presentation prepared, photos of the facility, the nurse's credentials, Jack's care schedule typed up perfectly. "Ashley's been there for me through everything. I really want to be there for her wedding." Jake spoke first. "Rach, you know Sarah just got her braces. That orthodontist is bleeding us dry." Then Mom chimed in about the new roof they needed. Dad mentioned his fishing trip was already paid for, non-refundable. She didn't even expect a response from me. She just sighed and buried her face in her hands. And maybe if it was left there, then she'd forgive us. But no. Over the next week, Jake posted pictures from Disney World. $7,000 for 5 days, someone commented, and he replied with laughing emojis about it being worth every penny. Mom was showing off her new designer purse in her book club photos. The receipt she forgot to crop out? $800. Dad didn't just go on his fishing trip. He upgraded to the VIP package. I know because he wouldn't shut up about the private guide and gourmet meals. I texted to ask if she was doing okay, but she never replied. 2 weeks after the wedding, everyone gathered at Mom's for Sunday dinner. Jake was complaining about the Disney crowds. Mom kept touching her new purse like it might disappear. Dad wouldn't stop talking about some fish he almost caught. And Rose? She served Jack's plate first, like always, making sure his food was cut just right. That's when Jack dropped the bomb. "Hey Rose, show them the video Ashley sent from the wedding." Rose's face went pale. "Later, Jay." But Jack, God bless him, pulled out his iPad. "No, they should see. Ashley's sister gave this beautiful speech about friendship. Made everyone cry." The video started playing. There was Ashley's sister at the microphone, talking about how Ashley had saved an empty chair for Rose, how she'd been the maid of honor for 15 years, even if she couldn't be there. The camera panned to a decorated chair with Rose's photo and a sign, "For the sister who sacrifices everything for everyone else." The whole table went quiet. Then Jack kept scrolling. "Oh, and look at these comments on Jake's Disney post. Screenshot after screenshot. People asking where Rose was, why she never gets a vacation. One from Ashley herself. Must be nice. Meanwhile, your sister can't even get to my wedding." Jake slammed his hand on the table. "Jack, that's enough." But Jack wasn't done. He pulled up Mom's purse photo next. Funny how there's always money for everything except helping Rose. Rose finally broke her silence, but not how you'd expect. She laughed. This hollow, broken sound I'd never heard from her before. Then she stood up and walked to the whiteboard Mom keeps in the kitchen for grocery lists. Started writing numbers. "Jake, your Disney trip, $7,000. Mom, your purse collection this year, $3,200. Dad, your fishing trips, $5,500. She kept going, listing every vacation, every splurge, every luxury from the past year. The total at the bottom made everyone squirm. I asked for $800 total, split 5 ways. She turned around, and I've never seen her look so tired. "I haven't been to a dentist in 3 years. I cut my own hair. I wear the same scrubs from 2015, because every penny I save goes to Jack's care, and I've never complained, never asked, until now." Mom tried to speak, but Rose held up her hand. "I just got a call yesterday from Massachusetts General, my old attending. He said there's a position open. He pulled strings to hold it for me if I want it." Everyone erupted. "What about Jack? You can't just leave. This is your responsibility." That's when Rose smiled, a real smile this time, and said something that made everyone's blood run cold. Rose's smile made everyone lean back in their chairs as she set down her fork. She reached into her bag and pulled out a letter with the Mass General logo. Mom's coffee mug crashed to the floor when Rose said she'd already accepted the position and would start in 3 weeks. Jake shot up from his chair so fast it tipped backward. His face went red as he started yelling about abandoning Jack. Rose pulled out a thick folder she'd been holding under the table. She opened it to reveal color-coded charts covering 15 years. Blue dots marked Jake's visits, only 12 total. Red dots showed Mom and Dad's help, averaging 2 hours per month. Green dots for financial contributions sat empty except for Jack's disability checks. The kitchen went silent except for Jack's iPad still playing Ashley's wedding video in the background. Rose flipped to January 3rd, where Jake had promised weekend care but canceled for his ski trip. February 15th showed Mom backing out of helping with Jack's bath to go shopping. March 22nd had Dad forgetting Jack's therapy appointment for golf. My hands shook as I watched our parents' faces crumble with each page she turned. Rose's voice cracked when she asked if they really thought she was abandoning Jack after being abandoned by all of us for 15 years. She pointed at Jack, who was already swiping to another video on his iPad. The screen showed Rose alone in their apartment at 3 in the morning, crying while preparing medications. The timestamp read, Christmas morning while we'd all been sleeping off dinner. Jack said quietly that she didn't know he'd recorded it, but this happened every single night. Mom tried to speak, but Rose cut her off by mentioning the $300,000 salary at Mass General. She pulled out her bank statements showing she currently made nothing and lived off Jack's disability payments. Dad's face went red as he stood up and started shouting about family taking care of each other. Rose laughed that same hollow sound and asked who took out loans for Jack's specialized van. She listed maxing out credit cards for his wheelchair and learning physical therapy herself when insurance denied coverage. Jake's wife Sarah had been quiet in the corner, but suddenly told Jake to show their bank statements. Jake's face went white as Sarah pulled out her phone. She revealed the Disney money came from her mother's inheritance meant for emergencies. Sarah stood up with tears streaming down her face. She said they could have helped Rose, but Jake insisted she chose this life and wanted to be a martyr. Jake turned on his wife and started yelling about family dynamics she didn't understand. Sarah's voice got louder as she said she understood that Rose gave up everything, while Jake gave up nothing. Jack pulled his tablet out from the side of his wheelchair and started swiping through files. His hands were steady as he opened folder after folder labeled with dates going back a whole year. The room got real quiet as he turned the screen toward everyone. Video after video started playing on the screen, showing Rose crying in the bathroom after Mom canceled on watching Jack for her job interview. Another one showed Jake on a FaceTime call telling Rose she was being dramatic about needing help. Dad's voice came through clear in one recording saying, Rose chose this life and shouldn't complain now. Jack looked at each person in the family while the videos played. He said he'd been planning to use these recordings to guilt everyone after Rose finally broke down, but she never did until now. Rose stood up and told Jack to delete it all. She said it real quiet, but everyone heard her. She walked over to Jack and put her hand on his shoulder. She told him they would help now because they had to, not because they wanted to, and the evidence didn't matter anymore because she was done trying to prove she deserved support. Mom started crying, and Dad looked at the floor. Jake opened his mouth to say something, but Sarah grabbed her purse and walked out with the kids. 3 days later, I showed up at Rose and Jack's apartment for my first training session. The living room had been turned into a medical setup with a hospital bed, a Hoyer lift hanging from the ceiling, and shelves full of medications. Rose walked me through each piece of equipment without looking at me. She showed me how to work the lift system to get Jack from bed to wheelchair. The medication schedule was printed out and taped to the wall with exact times for 20 different pills. She demonstrated the catheter care and the exercise routine the physical therapist had designed. Her movements were automatic, like she'd done this 10,000 times. She explained that Jack liked his coffee at exactly 7:15 in the morning. She said if it was too early, the morning medications would make him sick, and if it was too late, he'd get anxious about the day starting. Rose just pulled out receipts like a lawyer presenting evidence in court, and suddenly everyone's luxury purchases became Exhibit A through Z in the case of family hypocrisy. That whiteboard math lesson hit harder than any guilt trip ever. I watched her measure out the exact amount of cream and sugar he preferred. She knew which mug he liked best and how he wanted the handle turned when she handed it to him. 15 years of memorizing every single detail of another person's life was right there in front of me. Jake showed up 45 minutes late for his training session the next day. He complained the whole time about how complicated everything was. He kept asking why we couldn't just hire someone to do all this. Rose pulled out her laptop and showed him the spreadsheet she'd made. Professional care would cost $4,000 a month minimum, which came out to $48,000 a year. She asked who was going to pay for that. Jake said there had to be cheaper options, but Rose had already researched everything. Even the cheapest home health aid was $25 an hour for the level of care Jack needed. 1 week into the training, Mom called an emergency family meeting at her house. She said her back couldn't handle lifting Jack anymore, even with a Hoyer lift. Dad nodded along and said his heart condition meant the doctor told him no strenuous activity at all. Rose smiled that awful smile she'd been doing lately. She mentioned how interesting it was that Mom's back was fine for the outlet mall trip she'd posted about yesterday, where she carried 6 shopping bags. She pointed out that Dad's heart handled 18 holes of golf that same morning, according to his golf buddy's Facebook post. Mom started making excuses about how that was different, but Rose just kept smiling. Jake's phone rang during the meeting and Sarah's name showed up on the screen. He ignored it, but she called right back. When he finally answered, we could all hear her yelling through the phone. She'd moved back to her mother's house with the kids the day after the last family dinner. Jake hung up and turned on Rose, saying she destroyed his marriage. Rose pulled out her phone and showed everyone the text messages Sarah had been sending her. 3 years of messages begging Jake to help his sister more. Messages where Sarah offered to watch Jack herself so Rose could have a break. Screenshots of Jake's replies calling Rose manipulative and saying Sarah didn't understand family dynamics. Sarah had tried for years to get Jake to see what Rose was going through. Rose suddenly screamed that she gave up everything. It was the first time I'd ever heard her raise her voice like that in my whole life. She listed it all out loud. Her career, her 20s, her 30s, her chance at having kids, her relationships, her health, her dreams. She asked if they really couldn't give up one golf game or one shopping trip or one Disney vacation. Her voice cracked when she said Disney. Jack wheeled himself between Rose and the rest of the family. He told everyone to stop and turn to Rose. He said she should take the Mass General job and leave now, not in 2 weeks, but right now. Rose shook her head and started to say something about his care, but Jack cut her off. He said they would figure it out or they wouldn't, but she was done sacrificing for everyone. Rose looked at him for a long moment and then walked out of the room. I followed her to her bedroom where she started pulling clothes out of her closet. She called Mass General while folding her scrubs into a suitcase. I helped her pack and realized her entire wardrobe fit in just 2 suitcases. When I asked if this was really all she had, she nodded. She explained that everything else had gone to Jack's care over the years, like special mattresses, medical supplies, and accessibility modifications for the apartment. 2 days later, I watched Rose drag both suitcases down the front steps, while Mom stood in the doorway crying and begging her not to leave us alone with this. Rose just looked at her with these empty eyes and said, "Watch me," then turned to hug Jack, who was sitting in his wheelchair on the porch. She whispered something in his ear that made him smile, even though tears were running down his face. The Uber driver loaded her bags while Jake started freaking out about who would handle Jack's evening routine since none of us knew what to do. We all just stared at each other as the car pulled away, and Mom started breathing really fast like she might pass out. That evening, I tried to transfer Jack from his wheelchair to bed, and it took me 3 tries because I kept losing my grip on him. I almost dropped him twice, and my back was killing me by the time I got him settled. Jack told me Rose threw out her back 4 times over the years, but never said anything about it. While I was sorting his medications, I found this worn notebook tucked behind all the pill bottles and medical supplies. Jack saw me holding it and told me to read it because Rose would want me to understand what really happened. The first page was dated 15 years ago and just said day 1. I can do this for a few months until we figure something out. Every page after that showed everything she gave up, like the surgical fellowship she turned down and the guy she stopped seeing because he wanted her to move to Boston. One entry from 3 years ago hit me hard because Jake's wife had offered to pay for professional care, but Jake told her Rose would be offended by charity. Rose wrote that she cried for 3 hours after they left that day. A week after she left, everything was falling apart because Jake kept missing his shifts, claiming work emergencies, and Mom's back suddenly gave out after one transfer attempt. Dad hired some day nurse without asking anyone, then complained about the $800 daily rate. I was exhausted from covering everyone else's missed shifts and barely keeping up with my own job. Jack's seizure medication ran out, and when I called the pharmacy, they said Rose always handled the insurance pre-authorizations, which turned into 6 hours of phone calls and forms. The pharmacist asked where Rose was and if she was okay, since she usually picked everything up herself. Sarah dropped by with stuff for Jake's kids and mentioned how Rose always scheduled their visits on Jack's good days when his pain was manageable. She said Jake never knew Rose tracked Jack's pain cycles on a calendar to protect the kids from seeing him at his worst. That night, Jack had a seizure because I messed up the timing on his evening medications and didn't give them with food like you're supposed to. The paramedics who came recognized our address and asked where Rose was, since she always had Jack's medical history printed and ready. I rode in the ambulance realizing she probably dealt with these emergencies alone dozens of times over the years. At the hospital, the doctor looked at Jack's medication list and asked who had been managing his care because the schedule was completely wrong. We all started pointing fingers at each other until Jake finally said the truth that she left because we drove her away. The social worker who'd been watching our mess from the doorway pulled me aside while the nurses checked Jack's vitals and told me she'd been working with Rose for 5 years and asked if I knew Rose was pre-diabetic from all the stress. I shook my head, feeling my stomach drop as she kept going about the anxiety meds Rose had been taking and how she hadn't gotten a mammogram in 4 years because she couldn't leave Jack alone long enough. The guilt hit me so hard I had to grab the wall to stay standing while she showed me Rose's medical records that she'd authorized the hospital to share for Jack's care coordination. 2 weeks passed with us trying to manage Jack's care between the 4 of us and failing miserably until Dr. Harrison called the house asking if Jack was okay because Rose wanted him to check but was trying not to interfere with our family handling things. Mom grabbed the phone from me and started yelling that Rose abandoned us and her brother almost died, but Dr. Harrison just waited for her to finish, then said real quiet that Rose gave us 15 years and asked what we gave her before hanging up. That night I couldn't sleep, so I looked up Rose's Facebook, which she barely used anymore, and found her last post was from 3 years ago, showing Jack at physical therapy with a caption about his progress. I scrolled back through years of posts, and every single one was about Jack's appointments or milestones or therapy breakthroughs, but nothing about her own life, like it just disappeared completely. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived from the care facility Rose had researched, and inside was this comprehensive program with physical therapy and social activities and job training that would have given Jack a real life instead of just existing in Rose's apartment. Jake's divorce papers showed up that same week with a statement from Sarah's lawyer saying she'd offered to help Rose with Jack's care, but Jake wouldn't let her, and that watching Rose sacrifice everything while Jake did nothing was part of why their marriage fell apart. Mom completely broke down at dinner that night, crying into her mashed potatoes and admitting she'd been jealous of how Jack always called for Rose instead of her, so she convinced herself Rose wanted it that way. Dad held her while she sobbed about failing both her kids, and I just sat there watching our family finally face what we'd done to Rose. 3 weeks after Rose left, Jack was back home from the hospital, but he wouldn't eat and kept saying he took everything from her, which was true, but none of us knew how to fix it now. Ashley called the house and told us Rose was doing great at Mass General and was brilliant, like everyone knew she would be, but that she cried every night about Jack and loved him more than we deserved before hanging up on us. I tried starting a group chat with Jake and Mom and Dad to coordinate Jack's care, but it turned into immediate arguments about who could do what days and whose fault everything was and how much it would cost. Watching them fight over every little thing made me realize Rose had been dealing with all of this alone for 15 years with nobody to complain to or help her figure things out. Sarah tried to help Rose for 3 years while Jake called it family dynamics. That's like calling a house fire a heating issue. The irony of Jake blaming Rose for his divorce when Sarah left him for not helping Rose. Chef's kiss of poetic justice right there. I went to clean out Rose's old room at Mom's house to make space for Jack's equipment and found her acceptance letter to Johns Hopkins from 15 years ago for their surgical program with a full scholarship because she'd been their top candidate. A sticky note was attached that said, maybe someday, but the date on the note was from just last month, which meant she'd been looking at it recently and still hoping after all this time. The paper shook in my hands as I realized she'd been carrying this dream for 15 years and we'd stolen it from her. Jake called a family meeting that same week and announced he'd hired a full-time caregiver for Jack and was splitting the bill between all of us. Mom and Dad immediately started yelling about their fixed income while Jake laughed and pointed out Dad's fishing trip cost more than 3 months of care. The caregiver showed up once, took one look at our family screaming at each other over money, and quit on the spot. I moved into Mom's house to help with Jack, but I was useless at the medical stuff Rose had done so easily. Within a month, Jack had lost 15 pounds because I kept forgetting his meal schedule and his supplements. His physical therapy exercises sat undone because I didn't know how to help him through them properly. The house started smelling like old medical equipment that I didn't know how to clean right. I was failing him worse than when I was using because at least then I had an excuse. Dr. Harrison called one afternoon while I was trying to figure out Jack's medication schedule that Rose had somehow memorized perfectly. He said Rose had won some big research grant and wanted Jack to know she was dedicating her work to him. Jack smiled for the first time in weeks and whispered that she was finally free. Sarah brought her kids to visit the next week, and my nephew kept asking where Aunt Rose was because she always made Uncle Jack laugh. Sarah tried explaining that Rose had an important job now, but the kid just asked if it was more important than Uncle Jack. Nobody answered him. I started going to Al-Anon meetings again, but this time to deal with our messed up family instead of my addiction. Other people there had similar stories about one sibling who gave up everything while the rest lived normally. One woman said the guilt after they finally leave is unbearable because you can't pretend anymore that it was fair. 6 weeks after Rose left, Mom had chest pains and we rushed her to the emergency room. She kept mumbling Rose's name over and over, saying Rose would know what to do. The doctor said it was stress related, and I couldn't help thinking about all the stress we'd put on Rose that we never worried about. Jake showed up at the hospital completely drunk and started screaming about how his wife had left him and his sister hated him and he couldn't even take care of Jack right. Security had to drag him out while he kept yelling that everything was falling apart. Dad finally broke down in the hospital waiting room and admitted he was too old to help with any of Jack's care. He said he should have been honest from the start instead of letting Rose handle everything alone. The insurance company called the next day about Jack's coverage and started denying claims left and right. Turns out Rose had been fighting them for years, filing appeals and gathering documents to keep his therapy covered. Without her doing all that work, they were cutting everything off. The amount of money she'd saved us over 15 years was probably $200,000 that we never even knew about. We had to call a social worker to help figure out Jack's care, and she made us all sit around Mom's table for another family meeting. She looked at Rose's detailed records and then at Jack's current condition and told us straight out that our family was causing him harm. Jake tried to argue, but she cut him off and said Jack was declining fast under our care compared to how well he'd been doing with Rose. The social worker pulled out more papers showing how Jack needed professional help, and Mom started crying while Dad just stared at the wall. Jake kept checking his phone and muttering about missing work for this mess. 2 months passed after that meeting, and I'd taken leave from my job to handle Jack's care since nobody else would step up. My bank account was draining fast with all the medical supplies and special equipment Jack needed. I finally understood what Rose had been dealing with all those years. Every single penny went to Jack's medications and physical therapy and special foods he needed. I hadn't bought new clothes in weeks and was eating ramen most nights just to make the money stretch. The lifting was destroying my back, and I could barely sleep between Jack's night needs and worrying about money. Then one morning I found Jack unconscious in his bed with an empty pill bottle on the nightstand. He'd been hiding pain meds for weeks and took them all at once. The paramedics worked on him for 20 minutes before getting a pulse back. His note was sitting right there on his pillow, and it just said he wouldn't let anyone else suffer like Rose had suffered for him. The ambulance rushed him to the emergency room, and they pumped his stomach and put him on a ventilator. The psychiatric ward at the hospital was cold and sterile with locked doors everywhere. The psychiatrist met with us after evaluating Jack for 3 hours straight. She didn't sugarcoat anything and told us Jack's depression came from years of guilt about ruining Rose's life, plus anger at the family for letting it happen. She said he needed intensive therapy and professional care in a stable environment, not our dysfunctional family situation. Her eyes stayed on Mom and Dad when she said that last part. I walked out to the hospital parking lot and called Rose with shaking hands. She picked up immediately, and her voice was already panicked, asking if Jack was okay. I told her everything about the pills and the note and the psychiatrist's words. The line went quiet for so long I checked if the call had dropped. Then she said she'd be there in 3 hours and hung up. Rose walked through those hospital doors exactly 3 hours later, looking exhausted but determined. Every nurse and doctor recognized her and came over for hugs and asked how Boston was treating her. One older nurse grabbed her hands and said they all missed her so much and that Jack had been so lucky to have her. Rose's smile looked broken when she asked if he'd really been lucky though. The moment Rose entered Jack's room, he completely fell apart, sobbing and apologizing over and over. He kept saying he'd ruined her entire life and he was so sorry for everything. She held him tight and they both cried while telling him he hadn't ruined anything and that she loved him, but she'd been dying slowly and had to choose to live. Then Rose Rose turned to face all of us standing there, and her voice was steady but cold. She told us she'd been seeing a therapist at Mass General who diagnosed her with complex PTSD from caregiver burnout. The therapist also said we were textbook codependent enablers who let one person suffer so everyone else could avoid discomfort. Mom started to say something, but Rose kept going and pulled out a folder from her bag. She said she'd hired a lawyer and was prepared to sue for financial restitution for 15 years of unpaid caregiving labor. Her lawyer calculated it at market rate for a full-time caregiver, which came to about $900,000. Or we could agree to place Jack in the professional facility she'd researched and split his ongoing care costs fairly between all of us. Jake jumped up and slammed his fist on the bedside table, yelling that you can't sue your own family. Rose calmly pulled out her phone and started reading from texts Jake's wife Sarah had sent her for their divorce proceedings. She listed $40,000 on Disney trips alone over the years, and Mom's $75,000 in shopping, and Dad's $60,000 on fishing trips. She asked if she should keep going with the receipts Sarah had photographed. Rose put her phone away and spoke quietly but firmly. She said she wasn't trying to destroy anyone, but she was trying to save Jack and maybe teach us that love meant more than just words. It meant showing up and making sacrifices and doing hard things even when they hurt. She looked each of us in the eye and said none of us had loved either her or Jack enough to actually do any of that. The next morning, Rose drove us to the care facility while Jack sat in the passenger seat looking out the window at the trees passing by. Mom and Dad followed in their car, and Jake met us in the parking lot, his face still red from crying the night before. The director was this tall woman with gray hair who shook Rose's hand and led us into a conference room with big windows looking out at a garden. Rose had already sent over all of Jack's medical records and care plans, and the director kept nodding as she went through each page, showing us how they could handle everything. She showed us photos of the therapy pool and the special equipment they had for helping people get stronger, and all the activities Jack could do with other residents. Rose asked about visiting hours, and the director said family could come anytime they wanted, and Jack could even go out for day trips once he got settled. The whole time I watched Rose sitting there in her old scrubs with her hands folded on the table, asking every single question she'd probably been thinking about for years. When the director said they just needed our signatures on the financial agreement, Rose pulled out a folder she'd already prepared with everything organized. Jack wheeled himself over to the window and looked out at two guys his age playing chess on the patio. After we all signed the papers, the director said Jack could move in whenever he was ready, and Rose said he'd be there tomorrow. Rose showed up with lawyers and math like she was closing a business deal instead of saving her brother's life. 15 years of free work adds up to almost $1 million. Who knew? Back in the parking lot, Jack asked Rose to drive him home alone, and the rest of us could follow. In her car, Jack reached over and grabbed her hand and told her he wanted to go to the facility because he wanted her to finally live her life. Rose squeezed his hand back and said they could finally just be siblings who visited each other instead of her being his nurse all the time. That evening at Rose's apartment, she pulled out her laptop and showed Jack pictures from Mass General. All these doctors in white coats standing around fancy equipment. She showed him the tiny apartment she'd found near the hospital and the coffee shop on the corner where she was learning how to just sit and read without feeling guilty. She pointed at one photo of herself in scrubs, standing next to Dr. Harrison, and for the first time in 15 years, she looked actually happy. Jack stared at that photo for a long time and then pulled her into this big hug. 3 days later, we all met at a law office downtown where Rose's lawyer had set up a meeting. The lawyer was this older guy with thick glasses who spread out a bunch of papers on the conference table. He explained Rose had two options: either file the lawsuit for financial negligence or sign a structured agreement for Jack's care going forward. The facility would cost $4,000 every month and split 5 ways that came out to exactly $800 each, the same amount Rose had asked for to go to Ashley's wedding. Nobody said anything about the irony, but we all felt it sitting there like a rock in our stomachs. Mom started crying and said she couldn't afford $800 every month, but the lawyer pulled out bank statements showing she'd spent $1,100 on decorative pillows just last month. Dad tried to say something about his retirement, but the lawyer cut him off and showed a paper with his boat payment of $950 monthly. Jake just sat there shaking his head as the lawyer pulled out credit card statements showing Disney World charges and restaurant bills and all the money we'd spent while Rose wore the same scrubs from 2015. Then the door opened and Sarah walked in carrying a manila folder. She said she was there as a witness and had been documenting everything for 3 years, hoping someone would finally help Rose. She handed the lawyer a USB drive and said it had every broken promise, every excuse, every time Rose begged for just a little help and got nothing. The lawyer plugged it into his laptop and started scrolling through screenshots of text messages and emails and even recordings of phone calls where Rose was crying and asking for just 1 weekend off. Jake signed the agreement first without even looking up from the table. Mom and Dad signed next with shaking hands, and I signed last while Rose just sat there looking tired, like 15 years of exhaustion couldn't be fixed by signatures on paper. A week later, we all showed up at Rose's apartment to help Jack pack for the facility. Rose had already labeled everything with his name and created these detailed instruction sheets about his medications and daily routine and what foods he liked and didn't like. She'd made photo guides showing exactly how he liked his room arranged and which side of the bed he preferred and how many pillows he needed for his back. The facility nurse who came to help with the move kept saying Rose had thought of everything, and you could tell she was impressed by how organized it all was. Jack had his own surprise though and pulled out a photo album he'd been making secretly over the years. Inside Inside were hundreds of pictures he'd taken or collected of Rose, sleeping in hospital chairs during his surgeries, studying medical journals while doing his physical therapy exercises, celebrating every tiny victory, like when he could move his fingers again. At the bottom of each photo, he'd written little notes about what she'd sacrificed that day to be there with him. He handed it to her and said she was never just his caregiver, she was his hero. Rose flipped through the pages with tears running down her face, seeing 15 years of her life through Jack's eyes. When we got to the facility, they showed us Jack's room with its big windows looking out at a garden with walking paths and benches. The room had adaptive technology built into the walls, buttons he could reach from bed to control the lights and TV, and even the window shades. Down the hall was the therapy pool with special lifts and warm water for his muscles, and a whole gym with equipment designed for people in wheelchairs. Jack rolled over to the window and watched other residents playing cards in the common room and said quietly that he could have been here for years if they'd just helped. Rose nodded and said they both could have had different lives, but at least they were starting now. We walked back through the hallway toward the exit, and Mom kept reaching for Rose's arm, but Rose stayed just out of reach until we got to the parking lot, where Mom finally caught up and tried to pull her into a hug, but Rose stepped back and shook her head. Mom's arms dropped to her sides, and Rose looked at her for a long moment before saying she needed time, maybe a lot of time, because they weren't just absent, they were cruel. They watched her disappear and felt relief that it wasn't them. Mom's face crumbled, and she opened her mouth but had nothing left to give her, and Rose got in her car and drove away, while we all stood there in the cold October wind. 2 weeks after Jack's placement, I drove to the facility and found him in the activities room playing cards with 3 other residents and laughing at something one of them said. He rolled over when he saw me, and we went to the courtyard, where he told me about the swimming therapy and the art class he'd joined, and how the physical therapist thought he might get more upper body strength back. He admitted he felt guilty for being happy, and said Rose suffered so he could be here, and I reminded him Rose was happy too now, working at the hospital she'd always dreamed about. That same week, Rose sent a group email with just one photo attached, showing her in surgical scrubs, holding a certificate that said she'd completed her first successful surgery as a tending physician. The message said the patient was a young mother who would walk again, and she'd helped someone walk again, and no one in our family knew how to respond to that. Jake called me the next month to tell me his divorce was final, and Sarah got everything including the house and most of their savings. He was moving to an apartment closer to the facility, and said maybe if he showed up for Jack consistently, it would mean something, and it was the first mature thing I'd heard him say in years. Mom started selling her designer bags on some website, and told Dad she was putting all the money toward Jack's care fund, which covered 3 months of extras at the facility. Dad sold his boat the next week without anyone asking him to, and that covered another 6 months, and Rose didn't acknowledge any of it, but Jack noticed and thanked them both. 3 months after placement, the facility director called to say Jack had been selected for an experimental treatment that might improve his mobility, but insurance wouldn't cover the $40,000 cost. Within 2 hours, every family member had wired money without hesitation, and for once the money appeared immediately, and Rose heard about it from Jack during their video call, not from us. I went with Jack to his first treatment session and watched them attach electrodes to his legs while he gripped the rails, and told me he felt hopeful for the first time in years. He said Rose gave him his life back by leaving, which was fucked up, and I agreed it was very fucked up, but at least he had a life now instead of just existing in her apartment. A few weeks later, I saw Rose's name on a medical journal article about caregiver burnout and family dynamics, and even though she didn't name us directly, we all recognized ourselves in every case study she described. The dedication at the end read for caregivers who love too much and families who love too little, and Mom cried when she read it. When December came around, Mom invited Rose to come home for Christmas dinner, and Rose's response came within an hour, saying she'd be in Hawaii with Ashley, who was teaching her to surf, and she was learning to do things just for joy, which was a foreign concept she knew. Mom cried for 3 days straight, and Dad kept saying Rose would come around eventually, but I knew better because Rose had finally learned to choose herself. 6 months after Jack's placement, he called a family meeting at the facility, and we all showed up thinking something was wrong, but he was smiling bigger than I'd seen in years. The treatment was working, and he had some sensation returning in his legs, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic about more improvement, and we all started celebrating. But Jack held up his hand and said he wanted Rose to hear it from him first because she deserved that. We sat quietly while he video called her, and I could hear her crying on the other end when he wiggled his toes for her, and she kept saying she was so happy for him, and he kept saying none of this would have happened without her sacrifice, even though that sacrifice nearly destroyed her. The screen lit up with Rose's face, and I'd never seen her look so happy, tears streaming down while she kept saying she knew something would come along, and Jack kept telling her she saved his life by leaving to save her own. After the call ended, Jack turned his wheelchair to face us and said he was going to walk again, maybe with help, but Rose would never get those 15 years back, and we needed to remember that every step he took came from years she'd never get back. The facility's social worker pulled me aside later that week and told me Jack was thriving because he wasn't drowning in guilt anymore, and Rose's leaving had freed them both, which made me realize the sick irony that Rose's sacrifice had been destroying both of them while we insisted on keeping it going. Sometimes the best therapy costs exactly $40,000 and 15 years of someone else's life, but at least Jack's finally learning the difference between love and sacrifice. I sat down that night and wrote Rose a letter, not asking for forgiveness, but just acknowledging that she'd been the only adult in a family of children, and we'd made her our parent, our sacrifice, our excuse, and I finally saw it now. She never wrote back, but Jack told me later she cried when she read it. A year after Rose left, Jack took his first assisted steps with the parallel bars, and we filmed it for her since she was in surgery. And when she watched it later, she texted back just 2 words, "worth everything," which made Jake break down crying about how we stole 15 years from her for this moment we were all sharing. Mom started therapy to understand how she became someone who could watch her child suffer and do nothing. Then Dad joined her sessions. Jake was already going, and I kept up with my Al-Anon meetings, all of us trying to become people worthy of maybe getting forgiveness someday. Rose won a major medical award for her research, and the ceremony was in Boston, but she didn't invite any of us, though Jack went in his new motorized wheelchair and sent us photos of Rose looking radiant, surrounded by colleagues who respected her, finally living the life she'd deserved all along. We started gathering monthly for family dinners to discuss Jack's care, with everyone contributing equally now. But there was always one empty chair at the table that was Rose's spot, and Mom would say maybe someday, while Jake would respond maybe never, and both were possible, both were fair. Jack sent us a video from the facility's talent show where he stood up, supported but upright, singing that old song Rose used to sing to him when they were kids, dedicating it to his sister who gave up everything and got nothing back until now, and we watched him standing because of her sacrifice while she was living because of her escape. 18 months after Rose left, I went to visit Jack for his birthday, and Rose was there, the first time I'd seen her since that Christmas, and she looked healthy, rested, actually alive for once. She didn't hug me, but she smiled, a real smile, not the tired one I remembered, and said Jack was walking and she was living and they both made it, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Thanks for letting me toss in my 2 cents along the way. You made this twice as fun just by being here. Catch you next time, clever friends, and like the video, it helps more than you think.